wanting to expand their client base. An investment firm in Boston paid for an insurance agent to fly out to New Mexico to explain to the Navajo Nation why they should purchase investments with their firm. The Bostonian was granted permission to hold a meeting in the community center where 95 persons gathered to hear what he had to offer. You know what, he began. More people are living to be 100. No one reacted. Continuing with his rehearsed presentation, do you know a lot of persons are outliving their savings in old age? Again, no response. It was obvious the young man from Boston failed to do his homework because, on average, the people on the reservation die younger than the general population. After the agent stopped his lecture for everyone to take a break, he sat behind a table covered with his materials for the presentation, exhausted, as he realized he was not connecting to his audience. Examining the materials in front of him to see if there was any way he could salvage his presentation, a local resident approached him and explained that for the Navajo, money is different. It's there to be spent. And if you have money, then you use it to help your family. The Navajo Nation did not have words for savings nor retirement. The Bostonian realized he needed to emphasize the importance of family in his presentation. So with the young man's assistance, he was able to show how savings could help others, not just the individual. After the Bostonian left, the 24-year-old resident was able to establish an investment team that didn't focus on participants, it focused on families. With unemployment as high as 70% of the reservation, the team that was developed hoped that by encouraging those who had jobs to save money, then they would be able to better help their relatives in the long run. Their investments were for the benefit of the wider family. Remarkably, the response was incredible. The team invested in themselves and purchased stocks, not just for retirement. They purchased investment tools to pass on to their children, who would pass it on to their children, and so forth and so forth. Each generation reinvesting, so when a family is in need, the funds are pulled together and utilized to support them. Or when a church or school building needs repaired or remodeled for the community's use, they do so with the intention that it will pass on to the next generation, and so forth. This long view of investing for the community and not for the individual is challenging for many of us to think about, yet not for the Navajo Nation nor for the early Christian church. They agreed to pool their resources as no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. The early Christians sold their houses and their land, and utilizing what they gathered, they invested in each other as they developed a community where no one had need. The early church was like a mutual funding company. The people sacrificed their capital so that they could care for those in need. For those who lacked companionship, the church befriended and cared for the widow and lonely. For those who are cast aside in community or oppressed, the church invested their ears to hear their pain and their mouth to make the rest of society aware of the injustice. For those who lacked food, heat, school clothes, or money for medical expenses, the church invested their resources into programs and missions. The early church replaced individualism with shared community values built on Christ and his actions. Mirroring his radical care for others, they took to heart his values, which is what made them so community focused. It also helped the whole group of those who believe were of one heart and one soul. Historian Wayne Meeks notes that the defining characteristic of the early Christians was their desire to be united, writing, "One peculiar thing about early Christians was the way in which the close-knit life of the group was seen to be simultaneously part of a much larger global movement. And this way of life was attractive to their neighbors who chose to convert to Christianity and share in this collective action recognizing they could be cared for, but more importantly, that they could care for others. It's been observed that these early converts recognized that they had been rescued by Jesus from sin and death, and they wanted to rescue others as well. The best way they saw doing this was to be a community that would feed the hungry, assist the poor, and give testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. For the early church, this was not about socialism or communism. Instead, collective care and pooling of their resources was responding to Jesus' teachings that we love our neighbor as ourselves. To apply a more modern understanding of what they were doing, they were crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing and crowdfunding is one of the major ways persons are caring for each other online. When a need is discovered, members of the GoFundMe community create a fundraising page for the need, and persons chip in to raise funds to solve the problem. This was essentially what the radical Christians in the first century were doing. They would tackle challenges through collective action by investing in each other. This still happens today. For example, in 2017, I attended a Just Jesus week-long discussion seminar, which focused on the early life of Jesus and his crowdsourced instructions for the community to care for each other. It was at this event that I met Shane Claiborne, who led our discussion group about his experience working with the homeless. He said when he was in college, two of his friends told him they were going to Philadelphia to hang out with their homeless friends. Teaming up with them, he said at first he was afraid he would be robbed, but in the end, he claims the people in the alleys stole only his heart. Working with the homeless families, he discovered a group of 40 families was about to be evicted from an abandoned cathedral in North Philadelphia. Joining with a group that had been working with the homeless, they became known as the Yacht Club, which stood for Youth Against Complacency and Homelessness Today. Though the Yacht Club was not for boaters, he laughingly commented that they would sometimes get a boater or two who would call them for additional information. Explaining who they were and the work they were doing, they would often get a donation. Their crowdsourced Christianity and their efforts to assist those in need raised enough funds that they were able to relocate all 40 families into new housings as they bought an old apartment building which took up a whole city block. Following their success, they moved into a small row house where they were able to share food with folks who needed it. And they also began to run a community store. They reclaimed abandoned lots and planted gardens. They also rehabbed abandoned houses and created room for former prisoners to find a home. Of course, as Shane said at our conference, you don't have to move to Philly to meet a need. You just have to see the need and take collective action. Sometimes this means converting your space into a space for those in need. Other times it means showing up as a group at a city council meeting and speaking in favor of affordable housing, community gardens, or residential free parks. Sometimes it means showing up as a group to declare that racist flags and symbols of hate have no place in our community. The work of rescuing takes many forms, yet it's always best done when we do it as a community and as a group. And we don't typically have to look very hard or for very long to find places where we are needed or how we can gather our possessions to help. There are ways that we can help, and you'll hear about these next week during our annual meeting. There are real ways that we can get involved and share what we have to provide support for ourselves and for others. Sharing with each other to support each other, specifically the church, was the focus of the early Christians as they recognized what Jesus had done for them. And by sharing their resources, this became part of their unspoken testimony of what Jesus had done for them. Granted, this was countercultural, and it is a countercultural way of living which stands in contrast to the world. Instead of a me first, it was a us first. Instead of hate your enemy, it was love your enemies. And instead of storing up treasures on earth, They believed strongly in storing up treasures in heaven. In the crowdsourced emerging church, the members worked together to help those in need, and everything they had was held in common, emphasizing that instead of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, they pooled their resources and distributed aid to each as any had need, and the church was strengthened. Granted, this countercultural way seemed foreign to their neighbors, but for those in the early church, they recognized that the kingdom of God is backward and upside down, where the last would be first and the first would be last, where the poor are blessed and the mighty are cast down from their thrones. We today are still part of this backward and upside down kingdom, one that takes our lives in a new direction, one where we see a need and we gather to meet the need and thus change the world. We do this because, like the early Christians, we recognize what Jesus did for us. So we respond in a similar way, where we care for others and we recognize that we do our best work when we work and pray together and practice crowdsourced Christianity. Perhaps we would all benefit if we depended on each other, recognizing that no person is an island. A key lesson that COVID has provided us is that we are all in this together. We have to cooperate and wear masks, and when we have a spare mask to share, we can offer it to a neighbor or a stranger in need. Visibly, we are sharing in God's work as we provide health and safety to each other, knowing that we are going through this together. This type of crowdsourced Christianity is not about having dependence on each other, nor independence from each other. Rather, it's interdependence, where we find strength in our faith as we assist each other. This is a theme the Apostle Paul spoke about frequently when he recommended to the church that we weave our lives and souls together so we have one mind in the Spirit of God. As crowdsourced Christians, wherever we see a need, we rise to the call of duty with compassion as we follow Jesus' lead to care for each other, which results in changing the world for God's purposes. Sharing our resources because God shared with us the love of Christ and showered upon us uncountable blessings so we can in turn bless others. Doing so together and supporting Christ's bride, the church, we connect because God connects to us.